the United States dropped a second round of sanctions on Sudan. The reason? Washington says the Sudanese armed forces used chemical weapons back in 2024, and that Khartoum has failed to meet conditions required to return to compliance with Chemical Weapons Convention. Now here's where it gets interesting. Sudan has not stayed quiet, not at all. The Sudanese Foreign Ministry fired back immediately. They called the sanctions, and I quote, unilateral and illegal, based on what they describe as false allegation. They say the United States has provided no credible evidence, and more importantly, that Washington bypassed the technical mechanism and procedures that the Chemical Weapon Convention itself requires before imposing any penalties or sanctions. So we have two governments pointing fingers, a country already collapsing under the weight of a brutal civil war between the RSF and the Sudanese armed forces, and sanctions that kick in today, July 20, that could make things even worse for Sudan. What exactly are these sanctions? What is the United States accusing Sudan of doing? And why is Khartoum calling the entire thing politically motivated? That is what we are breaking down today. So family, if you're enjoying the breakdown, you can give us a thumbs up already. All right, let's get step by step into the conversation because the timeline matters. The whole story begins last year in April. The United States Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, made a formal determination. He concluded that the government of Sudan, specifically the Sudanese armed forces, had used chemical weapons in violation. Washington laid out the steps to Sudan, that Sudan needs to take these steps, submit a comprehensive declaration of any chemical weapon and related infrastructure, grant international inspectors immediate and unrestricted access, and demonstrate that they were no longer in violation. According to the United States, Sudan did not do any of those things. So by June of this year, Washington concluded that Sudan had failed to meet the statutory conditions. And that triggered a second round, which the United States confirmed during the OPCW Executive Council in The Hague just last week. This second round is broader and sharper. It includes the United States opposition to loan, financial assistance, and technical support for Sudan through international financial institutions. With only exception being humanitarian aid, it bans the export of U.S. goods and technologies to Sudan, and it imposes tighter control on exports that could have sensitive or military applications. In plain terms, ladies and gentlemen, if you are Sudan, accessing international credit just became significantly harder, most especially among countries that wield so much proximity with the United States. Importing American technology, even dual-use equipment, is now blocked. The financial chokehold has tightened.
According to some analysts, the impact of these sanctions on the war-torn country will be limited. The Sudanese Central Bank, for example, claims that there are no direct U.S. exports to Sudan.
The second aspect of the sanctions is the impact on the US administration's credit lines and what it pays to Sudan. Currently, the US administration doesn't pay anything to Sudan, whether it's the organizations or the institutions.
You see, now let us get into what the United States actually told the world during the OPCW session in The Hague. Ambassador Nicole Champagne led the U.S. delegation, and the language she used was strong, as it gets. The United States said, and I quote from their official statement, "The prohibition on the use of chemical weapons is absolute and non-negotiable." They said their conclusion was based on what they called a rigorous, independent technical analysis that determined that the Sudanese armed forces used chemical weapons in 2024 and that Sudan remained in non-compliance through 2025. Now here is where things get very, very specific. The United States rejected Sudan's international investigation outright. Khartoum has established a national technical committee to look into the allegations. Washington response: domestic bureaucratic mechanism are not substitutes for treaty compliance and independent verification. They also clarified something important. The United States did not send investigators to Sudan. They did not direct an internal inquiry. They conducted their own technical assessment independently and shared the findings with the Sudan authorities. And perhaps most significantly, the US questioned whether Sudan should even continue to sit on the OPCW Executive Council. The argument was blunt. A state party that had used chemical weapon and failed to return to compliance should not be involved in guiding the organization's decision at all. To quote them directly, the credibility of our institution is at risk, according to the United States. Now, what you need to understand here, ladies and gentlemen, is that this is not just about Sudan. The United States is drawing a line for the entire chemical weapon convention system. The message is, if you are on the Executive Council, you had better be in full verifiable compliance. Otherwise, your seat is a problem for the entire gathering. This is what makes this more than just a bilateral dispute. It's a test case for the entire international chemical weapons regime. So with regards to Sudan's response, this is where the story gets really layered. Sudan Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation issued a formal press statement on Sunday, the 19th of July. They rejected the sanctions completely. Their words, unilateral and illegal. Now, Khartoum is making three specific arguments, and you need to pay attention to all of them, because they are not just saying no. First, they deny the allegation completely. They say Sudan neither produces, possesses, nor use chemical weapons at all. They said they had previously denied these allegations and are denying them again. Second, and this is the legal meat of their argument, they are accusing the United States of bypassing the Chemical Weapons Convention's own procedure. The convention had technical mechanism for investigation of allegations. Now, there is a process. Sudan is saying that Washington did not follow that process, that the United States did not provide credible evidence, and more importantly, did not engage the technical verification procedures that the treaty itself spells out before slapping on sanctions. Ladies and gentlemen, the third, they talked about political motivation. The foreign ministry stated, and I quote, that the sanctions are driven purely by political motives and do not reflect genuine concerns about preventing the use of chemical weapons. Now, I want you to think about that. What the third point really means. Sudan is essentially saying that the United States is not actually worried about chemical weapons. They are using this allegation as a political tool to apply pressure on the government of General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan for reasons that have nothing to do with chemical weapon compliance. You see, when a government makes that accusation, what they are really saying is, this is not about law, this is about leverage. And frankly, family, in international diplomacy, both things can be true at the same time. An allegation can be serious, and it can also be politically useful at the same time.
برهان مهما طال الزمن أو عملت تدق مادة كيماوية تدق شنو؟
This metal canister is the first proof of the use of chemical weapons in Sudan's civil war. The man is addressing General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, head of Sudan's army. These images were filmed in September 2024 at the Gari military base north of the capital, Khartoum, 5 kilometers from Sudan's biggest oil refinery, Al Jaili. The base and the refinery were in the hands of the Rapid Support Forces, a militia which had risen up against their former allies, the army, in 2023.
Sudan has strongly denied the...
Now, here's what makes the sanctions particularly consequential, and I want you to understand the full picture. Sudan is already the world's largest humanitarian crisis. Ever since the war broke out between the SAF and the Rapid Support Forces in 2023, April, the country has been unraveling. Gross domestic product has contracted by roughly 42%. Inflation, listen to this, jumped to 51.28% in June alone. The currency is plunging. Agriculture and oil export have collapsed. Around 5 million people are facing emergency or catastrophic level of hunger, even after intensive aid efforts. So when you layer a second round of sanctions that block international loans, ban technology, exports, on top of an economy that is already in free fall, the impact is not theoretical. It is direct, it is immediate. International financial institutions are now looking at US opposition to any assistance. That means the World Bank, the IMF, and the African Development Bank, any institution where Washington has a voice. Sudan is now going to struggle to access funding. And remember, the only carve out is humanitarian aid with this level of situation. The United States says it is enforcing Chemical Weapon Convention, a treaty that prohibits chemical weapons. Absolutely. That is a legitimate and serious responsibility. The use of chlorine gas as a weapon, which is what Human Rights Watch and other organizations have reported in Sudan, would be a war crime under the Rome Statute. But at the same time, when a country is already being torn apart by war, when millions are hungry, when the economy is collapsing, does tightening the financial news get you closer to compliance, or does it just make an already desperate situation worse? These are the questions, ladies and gentlemen, that diplomats are wrestling with right now. And there are no easy answers. So where do we go from here? The sanctions are now in full effect. July 20, that is today. The restrictions on loans, export, technologies, transfers are live. The United States has made its demand very clear. Sudan must submit a comprehensive declaration to the OPCW Technical Secretariat. It must grant inspectors immediate, transparent, and unrestricted access, and it must demonstrate that it had returned to compliance with the convention. But the Sudanese government is showing no sign of backing down. Their statement was firm. These sanctions are illegitimate, the allegations are false, and they would not be compelled by what they consider political pressure disguised as legal enforcement. Now, the third dimension of this, the OPCW itself. The United States has openly questioned Sudan's seat on the Executive Council of the OPCW. If enough member states agrees, Sudan could face diplomatic isolation within the very body that governs chemical weapon compliance. And that will be unprecedented because the OPCW has had disputes before in Syria, in Russia. But questioning a sitting Executive Council member of the OPC legitimacy is a significant escalation. And finally, there is the war itself. The sanctions do not directly target the RSF. They target the Sudanese armed forces-led government. General Burhan is already under international sanctions over alleged war crimes. Now his government faces a financial blockade. What does that do to the balance of power in the civil war? Does it push the Sudanese armed forces towards negotiation, or this will make them more entrenched? I think, if I'm being honest with you, the most likely outcome in the short term is a stalemate. Sudan will not comply with demands it already considers illegitimate, and the US will not lift sanctions without compliance. And the Sudanese people, millions of them, remain caught in the middle. The one thing to watch, and I want you to keep your eyes on this, is whether an African Union or an Arab League mediation effort gains traction here. Because if there is going to be a diplomatic off-ramp, it will likely come through regional powers, not through direct US-Sudan negotiation. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me bring this together for you. The United States has imposed a second round of sanctions on Sudan, broad financial restriction, export bans, technology control, all stemming from determination that the Sudanese armed forces use chemical weapons in 2024, and that Khartoum has failed to return to compliance with the Chemical Weapon Convention. Sudan has rejected these sanctions outright, calling them unilateral, illegal, based on false allegations, and politically motivated. They say that they have no chemical weapon. They've never used them. and the United States bypassed the convention's own verification procedure. And caught in the middle, a country already ravaged by war, with inflation above 50%, millions facing hunger, and an economy in free fall. What do you think about this, family? Do the sanctions serve a legitimate purpose in enforcing the Chemical Weapons Convention? Or is Khartoum right? Is this political pressure dressed up as legal enforcement? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to hear from you on this particular matter. If you enjoyed the video, kindly do well to help us hit the like, share, and subscribe button. And if you're feeling generous, you can leave a comment in the section below, because if you don't, Android will cry. Until the next time, this is the Android community. Stay informed, stay safe, and peace out.